Now, for James Heckman, and for writer Paul Tough for that matter, what is most exciting about the power of these non-cognitive skills is the possibility they would give kids the skills they need to get out of poverty, and the skills they need in the short run to counteract the effects of poverty on children in school. It's well documented that poor children do worse on tests and worse in school than better off ones. This is the so-called achievement gap. But what this new science seems to indicate is that what is holding these children back is not poverty. It's not the lack of money or resources in their homes. It's stress. If you grow up in a poor household, it is more likely to be a household that just stresses you out in ways the kids in better off homes are not stressed out. And that stress prevents you from developing these non-cognitive skills.
What was stumping me was, how does this work?
Let me introduce you to somebody else that Paul Tough writes about in his book. This is Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. In 2007, she set up a clinic for children in Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco. And she set it up there because poor minority communities like that one are often less healthy than other communities. She was an idealistic young black doctor, and she wanted to do something about that. She also had a master's degree in public health, but stress and its effects on kids wasn't on her radar yet.
I thought that if we kind of did the basic stuff, if we worked on asthma hospitalization rates and immunization rates and obesity treatment, those would be kind of the big public health things that we would need to do to make a difference in this community. And what I found in my daily practice was that a lot of folks were sending me kids and saying, oh, Dr. Burke, Bobby's got ADHD. Can you put him on Ritalin, or can you put him on some kind of medication? But when I did my job and did an actual history and physical, which is what doctors are supposed to do, what I found was most of these kids really didn't have ADHD, and most of these kids had issues associated with trauma.
Let me ask you to talk a little bit about the kind of trauma you're talking about. What was going on in their lives?
Yeah, so as a pediatrician, I feel like I had the opportunity to hear some of the real story. But we're talking about kids who are witnessing violence on a daily basis. And some of it was domestic violence, just domestic violence like you wouldn't believe. I had a family, sometimes it's almost mundane things. A family who, leave the house and they are boarding up their own windows because they're afraid that their neighbors will come in and rob them. I had a family where not only did their neighbors rob them, they took everything, including the food in the fridge and the toilet paper off the roll, right?
Wow.
Someone really robs you when they take your toilet paper.
She started to believe that there was some connection between the terrible situations these kids were living through and the symptoms they showed up with. Headaches, abdominal pain, difficulty with digestion. One girl's hair started falling out. Some little kids had a medical condition called failure to thrive, where they didn't grow well. But nothing in her medical training or her public health training explained this. So she researched. So she found this big authoritative study that followed over 17,000 patients from a San Diego HMO that showed that people who had adverse childhood experiences when they were little ended up with worse health that continued into adulthood. She says that for her, it was like that scene in The Matrix where Neo suddenly understands everything about the world. And as we talked, she was actually able to rattle off their findings from memory. She said if you had enough difficult childhood experiences,
you were 2.5 times as likely to develop chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in adulthood. Twice as likely to have heart disease, 2.5 times as likely to have hepatitis, 4.5 times as likely to be depressed, 12 times as likely to attempt suicide.
But in addition to all the bad things that are likely to happen to them as adults, there's also the effect that long-term stress has on them when they're still kids, especially on their brains and their ability to learn.
If you look on the molecular level, you're walking through the forest and you see a bear, right? So you can either fight the bear or run from the bear. That's kind of your fight or flight system, right?
Right.
And your body releases a ton of adrenaline, right? Which is your short-term stress hormone, and something else called cortisol, which tends to be more of a long-term stress hormone. And this dilates your pupils. gets your heart beating fast. Your skin gets cold and clammy. That's because you're shunting blood from anywhere that isn't absolutely necessary to the muscles that you need to be able to run from that bear. The other thing that it does, now you can imagine that if you're about to fight a bear, you need some gumption to fight that bear, right? So it kind of shuts off the thinking portion of your brain, right? That executive function, cognitive part. And it turns on the real primal aggression and the things that you need to be able to think that you're going to go into a fight with a bear and come out on the winning side, right?
Yeah.
And that's really good if you're in a forest and there's a bear. The problem is when, that bear comes home from the bar every night, right? And for a lot of these kids, what happens is that this system, this fight or flight response, which is an emergency response in your body, it's activated over and over and over again. And so that's what we were seeing in the kids that I was caring for.
When the brain does something over and over and over again, it creates pathways that get more and more ingrained. So this kind of repeated stress affects the development of these kids' brains. And especially affected in this situation is a specific part of the brain that's called the prefrontal cortex, which is where a lot of these non-cognitive skills happen. Self-control and impulse control, certain kinds of memory and reasoning, skills they call executive functions. If you're in a constant state of emergency, that part of your brain just doesn't develop the same. Doctors can see the differences on brain scans. Dr. Burke-Harris says that for these kids, the bear basically never goes away. They still feel its effects, even when they're just trying to sit there quietly in English class.
And if right at that moment, someone asks you, "Oh, could you please diagram this sentence?" Or could you please divide two complex numbers? You'd be like, what are you talking about? And so that's what we were seeing in the kids that I was caring for, is that a lot of them had a terrible time paying attention. They have a hard time sitting still.
And you hear about this in lots of schools.